And so we began our course with Chapter 16, Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. Excuse me. 1865, of course, Lincoln had already been assassinated, but basically you have to have emancipation before you can have Reconstruction. And of course, he is a symbol for freeing the slaves. In the South, we're very unique in the South. And if we don't like the way something's going, we have a tendency to color it, if you would. Instead of losing the war, the recent unpleasantness, it becomes a symbol of courage against great odds because you were going against the North. And they built statues of all the fallen Confederates that they could find, usually on a horse with a big hat, and had a Confederate Memorial Day. They had a reinterpretation of the past. I mean, they took the facts, but they just reinterpreted them to their own liking. And they all viewed that these newly freed black people were adversaries. So we have a goal, and the goal is to preserve very strict racial boundaries. But what does freedom mean to the black man? Freedom to do what? Well, the War of Liberation had been for them just that, not a lost cause. And because of it, being free, you escaped the horrors and the injustices of slavery. Now you could enjoy the rights and opportunities of the American citizenship just like the white man. You could hold meetings. You could go to the church of your choice. You didn't have to have white supervision when you were there. You could own a dog. You could own a gun and buy liquor. You could move around freely to find work and look for your other family members. And you could even move to a city if you wanted to. You could get legally married. You didn't have to just jump over a broom. And of course, with the aid of this newly created thing called the Freedmen's Bureau, you could gain land. And I have question marks for that. We have a picture here. One of the best things that the Freedmen's Bureau did was set up schools. And this is a picture, an actual photograph of the schoolhouse in post-Civil War, just outside the schoolhouse. In this particular one, we have an African-American teacher. But as you can see, you've got all different ages there because it's a one-room schoolhouse. And it didn't matter whether you were old or young. There you have a picture of a mother and a daughter reading. The daughter wants to learn how to read because it's going to be a way to improve her situation, and the grandmother wants to learn how to read to be able to read the Bible. And Northern philanthropic organizations and church groups in the North and the South, they all established more than 3,000 schools where old, young, men and women, boys and girls all came. And they weren't just satisfied with just establishing schools, elementary schools. They began to establish black colleges, although we'd had a few established before this, mostly over in Ohio. But now we're seeing it big time. But the white Southerner, they objected to this black education. After all, if you're busy in the schoolroom, you hadn't got time to do your work. And besides which, you don't need to know how to read and write to plant cotton or pick cotton. There's always some legitimate excuse. But families became very, very important. Reuniting was the #1 priority, of course, and once you found your family that had been sold or moved from their plantation, it became more white-like. The women could actually stay at home and take care of the children and bake and work in the yard, and the men would be the breadwinner, which was the ideal situation. But unfortunately, poverty being rampant, many black women were forced to work outside the home, but they still had their own home to go to. And this rumor of 40 acres and a mule, how did it get started? General William Tecumseh Sherman, he issued a field order in January of 1865, where it was supposed to be something temporary, not permanent, that the abandoned lands located from Charleston to Florida, basically the Sea Islands outside of Charleston, you were going to be given 40 acres to farm. And even in the beginning, the Freedmen's Bureau was renting abandoned lands. And they passed something from Congress called the Homestead Act, which gave anyone free rights to gain land. It had a land grant, but black people did get preference. But even if you got one of the Sea Islands or the Freedmen's Bureau rent you some land, or you need to homestead a land, going to be hard work because you can't just all of a sudden go out in a blank field and squat and say, well, this is my home. I mean, where are you going to get the seed to plant? Where are you going to get the horse to help you plow? Where are you going to get the milk to milk and, I mean, a cow to milk and get eggs from chickens? I mean, you've got to have something to get it. And if you don't have any money, you need credit. But credit is something the black man had a very hard time getting. So making a go of it was not going to be easy, even if you were free. So here, this sounds good. On paper, it looks great. Sharecropping. The white man has land. The black man has a strong back. So why don't we get them together and then split the profits? I mean, I'll furnish the land and the seed, you furnish the work, and we'll split the profits. It sounds perfect. But unfortunately, this black man, well, he doesn't have any place to live. He's got his wife and kids, so being a good old plantation owner, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. He says, I'll furnish you a house. I'll give you maybe a slaughtered pig. I'll even open up a line of credit for you at the local store so you can go in there and get what you want. Well, this is perfect. There's just one problem. The black man had never been taught how to manage money, how to budget, how to do anything. So he goes into the store and he says, I want this. And well, before you know it, he's got material for his wife to make a dress. He's got shoes for the kids. He's got candy. He's got things that he never thought he'd ever have. So when it comes time for harvest and splitting the profits, the black man owed pretty much what he had made to the company store. There used to be an old Tennessee Ernie Ford song called I Owe My Soul to the Company Store. The harder I work, the further behind I get. The title of the song was 16 Tons. You know, 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. But the meaning of freedom to the newly freed black men and women, well, it meant that maybe they could move to the city. It'd be better in the city, right? Nah. Treatment's going to be bad there. You couldn't find work, and if you did find work and you're working alongside a white man, he'd just walk off the job because no white man was going to work beside a black man. You couldn't find any place to live, so you had to go further outside of town, and before you know it, you've got little black ghettos set up outside of town. And I've got a picture to show you at the end of this slideshow to have an example of the type of living conditions that the black man had. It's one of those damned if you do and damned if you don't. But the church has always played a big part in the black man's life. And the newly freed black man's life, it was an even bigger part. For those of you who don't know, I also teach black history over at Western Kentucky University. And we spend a great deal of time trying to explain to people how strong the family was to the black man and how much religion meant to him. This was something they did not lose when they came over from Africa. But since we're free now, we don't have to go to the white man's church. And we're going to go to the black churches. We're going to form them ourselves and make our own rules. And once you get in this group of people who are your contemporaries and your equals, you learn how to deal with life from someone who knows a little bit more than you do. What it's like to be a free person. Because when you stop and think about it, if you just turn someone loose who's been under bondage for years and years and years, it's like take your 3-year-old child. You've had her in this fence all for 3 years. And all of a sudden you leave the fence gate open so she can get outside that fence. Well, what's the first thing she's going to do? She doesn't know about cars. She doesn't know about dogs. She's going to run like crazy because she's free. And this is unfortunately what a lot of the newly freed people did. They had no concept of what it was like to be free. So the church helped them learn what it was like. And they operated schools because so many of the people wanted to learn how to read the Bible. Something other than what the white man said, slaves obey your master. And they'd be taught the importance of politics and how to get involved and how to vote. But even with all this good stuff happening, if you gain any real freedoms to make them last, you're going to have federal support because the white Southerner is not going to change of his own volition. So we have 3 types of Reconstruction. We have federal Reconstruction, presidential Reconstruction, and congressional Reconstruction. And of course, all 3 had their own say. And the federal Reconstruction started immediately as soon as the war was over, and it began pretty much with Lincoln's 10% plan, which I thought was absolutely asinine. If 10% of the registered voters from 1860 were to vote in a new constitution where they outlawed slavery, they could be readmitted to the United States. Well, 10% of the voters registered in 1860, folks, they were all white. And of course, in the federal government, you never have agreement on anything. They couldn't agree on who was going to be the leader. No agreement on the policy. Then you have this big division between the moderates who just wanted to get on with their lives, the war's over, and the radicals who had different plans. Now I want to introduce you to Andrew Johnson. He don't look too bad in this picture. Now, I've got a couple of pictures of him that his nose is bright red, his eyes are bleary. He looks like what he was, basically an alcoholic. But the man had qualifications up to yang-yang. Of course, he ended being Abraham Lincoln's vice president and then president. He was in the House of Representatives, representing from Tennessee. He was the governor of Tennessee. He was in the state legislature in Tennessee. He was an alderman of Greenville, Tennessee when he was 19 years old. He also became mayor of Greenville. He was in the Tennessee House of Representatives, the Tennessee state senator, and Lincoln even appointed him governor of Tennessee after the war. The man had been in politics from the time he was 19. He was well educated, well versed. He should have been perfect for the job. Now that's his political qualifications. Let's look at him as a person. Now I do have a little short, I think it's 2 or 3 minutes, YouTube at the end of the lecture for you to watch it. It gives you the basic facts. It's an educational video of basic facts of President Johnson. But let me tell you about Andrew Johnson, the man. Now, he was born in North Carolina, even though he spent most of his life in Tennessee. His parents were very poor. They lived up in those mountains back in there. It was just no good at all. And his dad died when he was very young. Well, he had siblings, and his poor mother didn't know how to make ends meet. So one of the things she could think of to do was to apprentice Andrew out to a local tailor. Well, becoming an apprentice in those days was akin to being a slave, because the man you were apprenticed to owned you body and soul. He could feed you, he could not feed you, he could whip you, but at the end of somewhere from 3 to 7 years, you were supposedly being able to go on and earn a living doing what he taught you. Well, let's face facts. At the age of 14, it doesn't matter whether you're poor, you're rich, or what. Young boys are a handful. They're not really kids, they're not really adults, and according to everything I've read, Andrew had quite a sense of humor. And he played a joke on the man he was apprenticed to, and the man he was apprenticed to got very upset and was going to beat him with a stick. Well, Andrew didn't want to be beat, so he ran away. Now, his mother had signed this contract, so by him running away, he became a fugitive and had broken the law. He went south, went down to South Carolina, stayed down there a couple of years, almost 3 years. When he got to be 17, somehow or another, he found someone who was friendly down there, and he finished his apprenticeship, and when he came back at 17, he knew how to be a tailor. Well, his mother had remarried while he was gone, but they were still dirt poor. So he manages to persuade them to move over to Tennessee. Well, number one, he had to get out of North Carolina because there was a warrant for his arrest out. And the story of that trip, they loaded everything they had up into a 2-wheel wagon, and they crossed the mountains out of North Carolina into Tennessee with one horse who was blind. He had to be led. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been in those hills in southwestern South Carolina and into Tennessee or not, but they're bad in a car. But I can only imagine what they were like before they had roads. But I can just see him leading a blind horse through the mountains. He went to the little place just barely across the line into Tennessee called Greenville. And he met this young 16-year-old girl who was the daughter of a local merchant. And she taught him how to read and write. So he was 18 going on 19 when he finally learned how to read and write. But he was a good man, even though he wasn't a big man. And first thing he did was run for alderman and then for mayor at the little town. He went to a local school and got educated and learned how to become a good speaker. He was very well liked. He was a good politician, and he was always out for the underdog. And I gave you that long list of things that he went through over the next 30 years. Civil War happens. And during the time Civil War happened, he was a senator from Tennessee living in Washington. And he is the only Southern senator who stayed in Washington when their state seceded from the Union. Well, he stayed in there, and he became a hero in the North, and he was considered a villain in the South. And after the war was over, President Lincoln, who had met him and knew him, appointed him as the governor of the new state of Tennessee. not new state, of the newly non-Confederate state. Well, the war is winding down. Everybody can see it. And Lincoln was smart enough to realize he's going to have some help binding the nation's wounds. So they decided to choose a Southerner to have him be vice president, and they chose him with all these credentials. He should have made a great vice president and a future president. And so he ran as vice president and won. But that's when, sometime or another, and I have tried for years to pin it down when. Now, whiskey has always been the drink of choice for the Americans, especially in the West. And Tennessee was considered the West as well as Kentucky. It was safer to drink than some of the water. And everybody drank heavy. But somehow or another, between 1860 and 1865, Andrew Johnson became a drunk. He was falling down drunk at the inauguration. And people even asked Lincoln, why don't you fire him or kick him out or do something? He said, no, Andy's a pretty good old boy. He says he's just having a good time. But there were red flags all over the place, and nobody saw them. And of course, once President Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson became the president. Now we start having problems. The senators had been for him becoming vice president and then president because he was a Southerner who stayed in the North, so it's obvious he did not like slavery and he did not like the Southerners. But they had it completely tied apart before. Yes, he was a Southerner, but he was a white supremacist. He was very pro-slavery. And he didn't hate the South. Who he hated was the large white plantation owners who would make fun of him because he didn't know how to read till he was 19 years old. And he liked to make clothes. He was good at it. He even made President Lincoln a suit when he was a president. I sent it to him, and he was, a grown man at this time. They were always making fun of him being a backwoodsy boy. So he hated these big, rich planters. Another problem is the Senate was not in session during the assassination immediately after. So Johnson, as the vice president, becoming the president, he had run the show for 8 months. 8 months, folks. He ran the show. So he modified Lincoln's 10% plan and began pardoning former Confederates like crazy if you had $20,000 or less. Now, $20,000 doesn't sound like a lot of money, but multiply that times 14 in today's currency. That's about how much it would be. If you had that much money, you were a rich planter, and he wouldn't get any part of you. But there was exceptions. There was a gentleman from Kentucky who was extremely wealthy and had supported the Confederates during the fight. And he went to see President Johnson, and we don't know for sure what happened. All we know is that President Johnson received him, and an hour later he walked out with a pardon, and he was a multimillionaire. But he also loved Kentucky and did a lot of stuff for Kentucky, but that's a story for Kentucky history. And he was also against any plan for land redistribution, and this is perfectly normal because the law is a funny thing. And if you set a precedent, and if we had taken this abandoned land owned by white Southerners and redistributed it, you set a precedent. So what would stop somebody from going to Maine or New York or New Hampshire and saying, well, I'm sorry, white man, your claim's no longer any good, we're going to take it from you. You can't do that. It's against the law to take something that's in somebody else's name, even if it is abandoned. And you sure don't want to take someone's land, because land is a status in society. With land, you can support your family. With land, you can vote. You can be part of the government. With land, you are somebody. So, let's don't do this. He was not for black suffrage. And most southern states went along with President Johnson. They kind of liked his ideas. After all, he wasn't being too harsh on them. But some of them had even refused to ratify the 13th Amendment, which was one of the things you do. You had to write a new constitution outlawing slavery and ratify the 13th Amendment. Well, they hadn't done it yet. As a matter of fact, the only state that had been allowed back in the Union at this point in time is Tennessee. Well, we had off elections, and it was not presidential election in 1865, and the southern states are sending their Confederates back to Washington, the same old racist people that were there before. And the same year, they also began to issue black codes, which are nothing more than local ordinances to I have restrained down here, but it's basically to control the newly freed black men and women because we're no longer are slaves, so we'll set up ordinances. As a matter of fact, in the little city of Owensboro, where you all are, I know for a fact, up until the 50s, late 50s, there was ordinances there that said that a black man couldn't be on the streets in Owensboro after dark. This was in the 20th century. They had ordinances, and I think it listed a few in your text. I mean, you couldn't own guns, you couldn't go to work here, you couldn't do this there. They did everything they could to put a leash on the newly freed man. December 1865. Congress is back in session now, and they are hopping mad. This man they thought was going to help them didn't. Now, the radicals themselves and the Republicans are small in number, but they're very, very vocal. And what's that old expression? It's a squeaky wheel that gets the oil. They managed to shout down the conservatives and the liberals. And a man called Thaddeus Stevens from Vermont was the leader. Now, what the radical Republicans wanted to do, they wanted to protect the newly freed men to make sure they got their freedoms. And most of all, they wanted to punish the South. That was one thing that was high on their priority. The South needed to be punished. They did not want land redistribution. Nobody did, except the newly freed black people. They extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau over Johnson's veto because Johnson thought you were being discriminatory because you were favoring the black people. Well, that's why it had been set up, was to help the newly freed blacks. They overturned the Dred Scott decision, and for those of you who haven't had the first part of the class, the Dred Scott decision Dred Scott was a black slave. He'd been taken to free territory that he sued for his freedom, saying that once he left a slave state and went to free territory, he was free. He went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that, well, they threw the case out, basically. I said he didn't have a right to sue because he wasn't a citizen. That no black man or woman in our country was a citizen. And the South, of course, loved that decision. And they passed the 14th Amendment to basically give them civil rights or to acknowledge that they were citizens. See, the 13th emancipated, the 14th declared that they were citizens. And if you were a citizen of this country, you basically should have had civil rights. Now, this is a picture of Thaddeus Stevens. And I'm sorry, I can't look at this man without wanting to laugh. He looks like he's been sucking on a lemon. Poor guy. Napoleonic pose to make him look more fierce, I guess. He was a true dyed-in-the-wool Yankee. He was a true radical Republican. I mean, the man never married. His whole life was devoted to abolition. He was quite the character. He didn't live too long, or he'd have made a lot of problems. But the women's suffrage movement, which had been set back a little bit because of the war, I mean, you can't fight for rights when you're out and busy fighting a war. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were very upset because the 14th did not give them the right to vote. Well, the 14th didn't say anything about voting. But Susan B. Anthony had worked hard for abolition. They had tied the abolition movement in with women's rights, and even Frederick Douglass was for women voting. But toward the end, he says, you know, we're tying too much into one thing. We're getting distracted. We need to have one focus. And right now the focus should be the abolition. We'll worry about that later. And when Frederick Douglass, the runaway slave, who was afraid of being, caught back, he went to England and managed to buy his freedom. Susan B. Anthony wouldn't have anything more to do with him because he was no longer a runaway slave. He was a freedman. People are funny. President Johnson, by the way, is against the 14th Amendment. He says they've got all the freedoms they need. But in those 1866 elections, Democrats lost big time. Well, the war's just over. And the Republican Party is strong, and the Democratic Party is badly bent, but it's not defeated. So the Republicans now have total control of both houses, the Senate and House of Representatives, and they have enough votes that they can override any veto the president comes up with, and they begin to do it. And this is just a picture of Susan B. Anthony addressing the House of Representatives over trying to get women voting. And as you can see, and even in the picture, most all of them are older. They're not the young, carrying a baby on a hip type person. They're the ones whose children are gone and they've got established financial situations. The Democrats had launched this terrible campaign against the Republicans, and Of course, they're for the freedmen. They're against the Freedmen's Bureau. As a matter of fact, the state Kentucky was the state of the South who was against it the most and caused the most problems. They burned down schoolhouses. They chased off teachers. But as you can see, it reads, an agency to keep the Negroes in idleness at the expense of the white man. Twice vetoed by the president, yes, and overturned by the Congress. And made a law by Congress. So support the Congress and you support the Negro. Support the president and you protect the white man. Very, very racist. So you've had federal Reconstruction, you've had presidential Reconstruction. Now the Congress is back in session. Congress is going to take over. And part of the problem is a battle of wills. Congress is always, the House of Representatives especially, has always thought that they should have more power than the president. And it's a continuing battle even today. One of the first things they did when they got back in session was pass this Military Reconstruction Act, which effectively divided the South into 5 military districts. And the reason they did this is because the South is obviously not trying to change or mend her ways. She's going on back, trying to go back the way she was. She's reelecting the same people that she had before. They've got all these black codes going on. So we'll just put some blue bellies down there. And one of the first things they did, of course, was have a voter registration drive for the blacks. And they were ready, willing, and able to enforce the readmission policy. Now, you're going to ratify the 13th and the 14th by now, and you're going to write a new state constitution, and you're going to treat the black man with dignity. Like I said, only Tennessee had been readmitted at this time. Then in 1867, Congress is very upset with the president. The president's very upset with Congress because Congress keeps overriding his vetoes. So they passed something called the Tenure of Office Act, which is, that's always caused a lot of confusion. Basically, what it says, well, when the Constitution was really set up, Washington had managed to get through, if we hire somebody to be on my staff, or to be on my, be one of my secretaries of something or another, I have the right to fire them if they're not getting along. Well, this has been the way it had been for almost 100 years. Now Congress passes a Tenure of Office Act, which says that the president cannot fire someone that's been approved by Congress. Well, the president thinks that they're usurping his power, which basically they are. But it's just kind of a burr under the saddle, so to speak, because they were trying to do anything they could to irritate the president. So the president's angry enough that he fires Secretary of State Stanton anyway. Well, number one, Stanton was a very staunch radical Republican. He was all for abolition, all for all the civil rights for the black man. So as soon as he fires him, Congress files these articles of impeachment. Now, the irony is it's going to be a Republican changing his vote because it failed to pass. And was it because all of a sudden they liked Johnson? No. Some clearer heads suddenly realized that, do you know what we're doing? We're going to set a precedent that if the House of Representatives does not like a president, we can impeach him. Now, he's done nothing of high treasonable. He's done nothing to cause, well, yes, he did violate that firing of the secretary, but that's not cause for impeachment. Maybe a censure, but not impeachment. So he fails by one vote to get impeached. But the president got the message, and the rest of his term, he kind of just sat back and let Congress go on its way. And they start getting ready for the presidential election of 1868. And then all of a sudden, someone with a good, clear mind realizes, we're pushing the South to make sure that these newly freed black men vote, and yet, what does your text say? You only had 2 states really in the North that allow the black man to vote? Isn't that the pot calling the kettle black? Well, Ulysses S. Grant wins. It was a foregone conclusion because we love to reward our war heroes with the presidency, like Washington being the first president. Grant's going to be president. We'll have a couple of more ex-military men. And Republicans do maintain control of both houses. So then in 1869, because of all the stuff that's going on, they passed the 15th Amendment, which basically says the black man can vote. So there's more to these amendments than this, but basically the 13th Amendment, emancipation. The 14th Amendment, citizenship. The 15th Amendment, the right to vote. That's what you need to remember, not the other incidentals, like we're not going to assume that Southerners votes and stuff like that. I mean, Southerners Civil War debts. But this really pushes Stanton to disavow the Republicans totally. It's just a pretty picture of the celebration of the 15th Amendment. Now, these Southern Republican governments, Kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? The first thing they started doing is making new state constitutions because we've got Republicans in. And they mandated the election of local offices, as you pointed out in your text, because a lot of them had been appointed. And I appoint my son, and my son appoints his son, and it gets to be hereditary. They start pushing for public education and social welfare, penal reform, and universal manhood suffrage. Well, this is pretty good stuff. It's something the South hadn't had before. And a lot of these yeoman farmers, and a yeoman farmer is nothing more than a man who owns his own land, they begin to become Republican because the Southern Democratic governments haven't been doing anything for the infrastructure or helping in any way, and they kind of liked the way it was going. Now, these people are called scallywags. Now, basically, the legal definition of a scallywag is a Democrat who votes Republican. But when I was growing up, I grew up in Kentucky, and I had lived with my grandmother most of the time, and she was a sweet little Southern thing. And whenever she'd say the word scallywag, she'd kind of whisper, "You're a scallywag." And to her, that was the worst thing you could call. Well, no, the worst thing you could call somebody is a reincarnation of Sherman. But scallywag to her was a dirty word. It was to most Southerners down there. And then you have these carpetbaggers, called because of the type of luggage that they carried. And most of them were Union soldiers or former Union soldiers who came down to the South to help them reconstruct. And the reason I have help in quotations, because you can't see me throw up my hands and go help. Basically, they're going to help themselves, their own hip pocket. We have many documented cases of these helpers who earn maybe $1,000 a year when they got there, and when they leave, they take $15,000 or $20,000 with them. And what they're doing is they're taking the town's treasury, charging outlandish fees and taking the money, and it's not being used the way it's supposed to. But in reality, less than 2% of the population was carpetbaggers, and there were even a few who actually did help. But for the most part, carpetbagger has become a derogatory phrase too. Well, we have a group formed, and folks, up until just a couple of years ago, we never heard of the Union League. I first came across it about 6 years ago when I was in one of my Black history lessons. I heard it mention the Union League, and I thought, well, what's the Union League? And I went doing some research, and I had a terrible time finding anything about it. Your text mentions it. I was very surprised, because the last text we had did not mention it. It was formed of the blacks, and they used the model of the Republican Party. And in theory, it was going to encourage the blacks to vote. It taught them how to vote and how to become involved in politics. But in certain areas, the Union League got a little bit militaristic. They started teaching them how to march and defend themselves, and they would have secret meetings. And this kind of upset the whites, the blacks having secret meetings. And also, again, from my Black history class, Black women do not put their light under a bushel basket, so to speak. They're very vocal, they're very strong, they're very opinionated. And whereas under slavery they had been a quiet little mousy person, they had to be, now that they were no longer slaves, these Black women thought, even though they couldn't vote, the husband's vote was a family vote. And man, if you even thought about voting Democrat, you were going to be bad and you would sleep on the couch, is one of the nicer things. And a lot of times these Black women would go to the polls with their husbands carrying a gun to make sure that no white man's going to try to make her husband vote Democratic. Like I said, they couldn't vote, but they sure could influence their husbands. And it would be the Southern legislature, especially South Carolina and Louisiana, which had a majority of elected blacks. And these were not men out of the fields who couldn't read or write, who picked cotton all their lives. It surprised the white Southerners how many educated blacks all of a sudden materialized. I mean, we've got college-educated blacks, we've got doctors and lawyers, and you're Black. I mean, what is this? Some of them were from the South, some of them had come down from other parts of the country to help. And of course, the Southern whites are crying, Black government, Black rule. But in reality, the areas that had the Black legislatures, they did more to help in the aid of social services and education for Black and white. They didn't just try to help their own people, they were trying to help people. But the white man is so ingrained with his racial prejudices, he refused to see the good for the bad. So Republicans began to appeal to Southern Democrats by passing an anti-foreclosure law and a stay law. That made them very happy, because if you've got no money at all, and after the war, being gone for 4 years, I mean, I don't have any money, don't repossess my land. And they began building programs like hospitals and schools and orphanages. They expanded women's rights, especially in the area of property ownership. They passed child abuse laws and child support laws. Well, this is good. So, you start seeing some Southern Democrats swinging over to the Republican Party and becoming scallywags. But all good things must come to an end, and high taxes because of after the war. And you're starting to see Republican scandals, especially in the Grant administration in Washington. You've got conflict in both parties over the participation of blacks. And you're unable to get land redistribution that so many people want. And these are just a few of the reasons that things are starting to wind down real fast. Our lovely white Southerners are still very angry over our lost cause. They don't like the fact that these free black men, they're walking around like they're equal to a white man. The only way to get around it is violence. Violence. And a lot of racist groups are formed. And the one that's mentioned predominantly in your text is, of course, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. And folks, here again, this is the first time I have seen in a textbook anywhere where it actually mentions that the KKK was originally nothing more than a social club. So let me tell you how it began. Right after the war, Tennessee was in a quandary, and the man who was before Johnson was picked to be the governor. His name was Brownlow. Brownlow was what we call a fence sitter. Whoever is around, he's for what you're for. He started out being pro-slavery, became anti-slavery. He was anti-suffrage, he's pro-suffrage. He just wishy-washed all over the place. Whoever was the strongest is who he supported. And he passed a law that the Confederate men, and of course there was a lot of them in Tennessee, they couldn't do anything. Couldn't vote, couldn't work, couldn't do anything. And also, what do you sit around? Now you get a bunch of young men who've got nothing to do. They're going to get in trouble one way or the other. But this was a group of 5 educated, college educated, in the classical education of upper class. They'd been upper class before the war. And they've got nothing to do, so they decide to form a social club where we could all get together once a week or once a month. And the first time they got together, they met in the judge's office in town. They decided that since there were so many of them, they needed to find a place to go. So they went out to a abandoned plantation on the edge of town, up on a hill, and had their parties there, their meetings there. And when they'd get together, they'd have bonfires, and they'd drink and hee-haw and carry on. And they decided that they needed to have a club name. And they thought, well, we're nothing but a circle of friends, so why don't we call ourselves the Circle of Friends? And since we're all classically educated, we'll call ourselves the Ku Klux Klan, which is really Greek for a circle of friends. Well, they gave them each, crazy names like you do in sororities and fraternities. And the strangest thing happened. The town fathers noticed that whenever these social club meetings were held, the blacks wouldn't be on the street. They wouldn't even go to the Union League Union League meetings, because consider the time, we're very superstitious. We don't know about science. I mean, if you were to fly an airplane back there, they'd think you were a witch flying. So, have you ever played a game with your child where you put a light behind your hand and had the shadow on the wall, and you used your hands to make animals? Well, during the night, when these fires were going and the guys were up there dancing and carrying on, there'd be these huge shadows, and they'd hear the screeching and the hollering and the laughing, and it scared the heck out of these poor black people. So they stayed home. Well, the town fathers thought, and before you know it, they formed more groups. They take control of the social organization. And in the beginning, the first year that the KKK was in existence, they did nothing but harass and scare people. Give you an example. Let's pick Texas. Okay. Texas, right after the Civil War. And the white people are having a time of it because these black people won't get off the sidewalks when a white man walks by, and they'll look them right in the eye, and they act like they're just as good as a white man, and it's just irritating to them. So they were hoping something could be done, but, you've got those dreaded blue bellies around to make sure everything's okay. So they're just in a quandary, and it's just kind of like a smoldering fire. And all of a sudden, you look out, say, to the east, and you see this big old thing of dust out there. And what is it? We got a sandstorm. What's coming? And pretty soon it gets closer, and you hear the clops of horses. Clop, 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 clop. And before you know it, there's a whole big troop of gray-clad men riding in perfect formation into the center of town. Now, whoops, dropped my book. Everybody still awake? Good. They ride into the center of town and they stop. And then they stay in one position facing forward, and all of a sudden, with even not a command being given, the whole troop turns around. And the same thing happens again. Very quiet. 15 seconds or so later, without a command, they turn around and they march back out of town. Now, what have they done? Nothing. They've come into town, turned their horses around, and marched out. But the town explodes. As a matter of fact, we get people shooting each other because they don't know who. That's the KKK. What are they going to do? Where's they going to come back? And we have cases of them riding into town and just stopping under a tree and not doing anything, just sitting there. They intimidated. They didn't do anything, but it was a threat of what they could have done in the beginning. Of course, it didn't take long for it to get even worse. But there was a lot of racist groups formed, and once the hotheads took over, and it's been told that Nathan Bedford Forrest of Mississippi had been asked to reform them, and we believe that this is some of his tactics. Yes, he believed being the firstest with the mostest and killing was what you did in wars, but these tactics, they were too well organized. And of course, then your text mentions the Colfax Massacre, which was the bloodiest peacetime massacre. It's just ridiculous what people, when they're frightened, will do. So the government had passed a couple of laws. They passed the Enforcement Act in 1870, which didn't stop the violence. They passed the Ku Klux Klan Act in 1871, which did not stop the violence. The only good thing about that was once they passed that KKK Act, the federal government now could override a state's authority and cause some problems. And of course, this is an exaggerated picture, pen and ink drawing of what the KKK was in their disguises. In the beginning, they did not dress like this. They just wore gray uniforms and occasionally something over their head, but nothing quite that elaborate. And again, somebody coming down from Ohio, the KKK says, no, no, no. And the North, well, it seemed like the North wasn't doing anything. They're getting tired of the South not changing. They're getting tired of not being able to get back to their business of business. They're getting tired of the violence. And they turn around and look, and all of a sudden they see a lot of crime and graft in their own backyard. Boss Tweed in New York City, over $100 million in the 1870s. Folks, that's several millions of dollars more than that nowadays. And there's a scandal in Grant's administration. Now, he wasn't a bad boy. He just thought that he had to repay favors, and he kept appointing people to government positions that were not qualified. But those Democrats in the South are starting to get it together again, and they begin to see themselves and call themselves redeemers, which simply means that the white Democrat control the South. And of course, they're claiming they saved the South from the black Republican rule, and they're openly terrorizing the blacks. Well, in the elections in 1874, especially in the South, Democrats claimed victory. But as mentioned in New Orleans in 1874, the White Leaguers tried to take over the government. And 8,500 of them showed up. And they weren't just KKK, they were just angry white people. And the federal troops arrived in time to stop it. But they would overthrow or murder Republican officials. And in Vicksburg, Mississippi, a group called the White Liners gained control of the county government, and they killed and wounded and ran blacks out of town and burned their businesses. It was a reign of terror in the middle 1870s. Now here you just got a picture where murder of Louisiana, sacrificed on the altar of racism. Yep, sure was. Hamburg, Mississippi. Whites burn homes and shops and kill blacks. And Democrats take control over the government and force the elected governor to flee. In South Carolina, they came up with this plan called the Plan of Campaign of 1876. And every white man was given the duty to intimidate, buy, or control, or beat, or whatever you had to do to control the vote of one black. And the federal government does not get involved. Oh, it passes that weak Civil Rights Act. Had good provisions to it, but it wasn't enforced. It's like any law, it's no good if it's not enforced. Now, this I thought was kind of ironic. We want the black man's vote. We want him to voting the way we want him to. So a gun to each side of the Republican's head to make him vote Democratic, because the blacks were all registering Republican, because that was the party of Lincoln. 1877, after the election, the Democrat Samuel J. Tilton and Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, and they both had equal qualifications. Hayes had been a governor of a state, but because of disputed returns in 3 states, and I hope you notice this, Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. Remember that debacle we had a few years ago over the dangling chads in Florida? President Hayes promised to remove federal troops from the South if they would throw the electoral votes to him. They did, and he did. So Democrats now control all Southern governments, and with the troops gone, so were any black rights that were gained. And so ends the Reconstruction. It's just a map showing you Democrat and Republican. The green is Democrat, as you can see, most of it's the southern states. You have the 3 disputed states, and the pink is the rest Republican. If you look at these numbers, Hayes and Tilton, there was very little difference. Hayes did not win the popular vote, and we've had that happen several times, that the man with the most popular vote doesn't get elected. It's the electoral votes that count. On page 459 of your text, and I couldn't say it better myself, so I'm going to quote, "The Southern view of Reconstruction permeated textbooks and films and standard accounts of the period, and the widespread acceptance of this view allowed the South to maintain its system of racial segregation. Southern Civil War heroes became saints, battles became holy struggles, and the Democrats had rescued the South from a purgatory of black rule and federal oppression." So was there any gains? Yeah. They were better off in 1865 than they had been before, because some of them owned land, few. Some voted, few. Black churches grew all over the place, and black schools are operating openly now. That's good. Incomes increased 46%, but that's not that big a deal when they had no income prior to this time. Sharecropping's bad, but sharecropping's better than slavery. But the federal government does nothing to stop racial segregation and loss of the vote for the blacks. And part of this is because they don't want to get involved. They don't know what to do. And it's a state's problem. The black man only wanted education, the vote, and land. Then he felt he would be just as good as a white man. But the journey to equality for the freed man did not occur. The opportunity to do something wonderful and earth-shattering had come and not been taken advantage of. The North even refused to admit racism on their part, and it seemed like all they wanted to do was change the big white landowners and the way of life in the South. So we will not see an end to segregation for almost 100 years. This is basically the Reconstruction of the South, and you'll notice that Kentucky wasn't involved. Actually, Tennessee didn't get involved. Of the 11 Confederate states, only 10 were actually involved. Tennessee didn't get involved that much. Now, this is what I was talking about. This is a picture of the living conditions. I mean, you could throw a rat through the walls of the house, and the chimneys bending, but it was better than sleeping on the ground. The great labor question from a Southern point of view, this is what they wanted. They wanted the black man back in the fields with me, back on my porch. Is this a Republican form of government? Makes you want to cry. And this is not a misprint. I forgot. Maybe when I got my book, that's what my paper and my glasses were. Okay. We're going to skip chapter 18, and your next reading assignment will be 19. But there is a word list there, not too many words, but you do need to print it out. And the words are on there. You've heard them all through the lecture. It's in your book. If you know the meaning of these words, because they'll be used either as the answer to a question or as a question. That being said, we're done.